event with Dr. J. Luke Wood as our keynote speaker. The intention of the event is to create a space for our campus community to understand what microaggressions are and discuss how they manifest in academic contexts. We will learn about the most common microaggressions experienced by students of color in education and about strategies that have been proven effective in challenging racial microaggressions in education. Before we get started, I have a few items to share with you about this morning's program. First, this session is being recorded and will be available on the Learning Initiatives and Student Success website and on the Center for Teaching and Learning Blackboard community site. Second is that immediately following Dr. Wood's presentation, we will be holding debriefing sessions to help us process the ideas presented today and to think about what they might mean for the WCC community. Lastly, the debriefing portion of the program will be followed by a closing activity that you won't want to miss. So please stay with us until the very end. Now, I'm honored to introduce to you Gabriella Corti, our Student Government Association president, who will start our program off for us. Gabriella?
Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to today's program. I am going to start reading the Multicultural event opening statement. Westchester Community College's multicultural experiences are designed to serve as inclusive spaces where students, faculty, staff, and administrators can learn, express aspects of their lived experiences, further enhance their sense of community, and challenge themselves while learning from the honest experiences of others. And furthermore, I'm going to read the land acknowledgement statements. Though this event is taking place virtually, we acknowledge that the college sits on the ancestral lands of the Suwannee people of the Wapinga Confederacy. We now take this moment to pause to honor these people and their land. If you'd like to learn more about the original people of this land, please contact the Department of Student Involvement for additional resources. Thank you so much for your time and have a great event.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. It's fantastic to see so many people in chat in the little the search engine participants today. My name is Nicole Champel, and I'm one of the faculty directors at the Center for Teaching and Learning at WCC. CTL's professional development theme for the 21-22 academic year is working together, inclusivity, collaboration, and reflection. Today continues our endeavor to foster inclusivity at WCC, to reflect on what inclusivity means, what steps we can take to make our campus community more inclusive, and the role of inclusivity in student success. WCC is a place of great opportunity for a diverse range of people, but there is work to be done. A group of WCC administrators, faculty, and staff had the opportunity to hear our guest speaker, Dr. Luke Wood, speaking at the Achieving the Dream conference several weeks ago, and we were energized by his presentation, and we're thrilled that he's able to join us today. In the year ahead, we will all be engaging in conversations that will require each of us to ask, how can I make meaningful change? How can I identify, listen to, learn from, then amplify the marginalized voices in the WCC community? How can I guarantee that every student feels fully supported in their academic goals? A more just future will take substantial work. It's a world we haven't seen yet, but I'm hopeful as I see the work we're doing here today that it's possible and that the effort is worth it. Thank you again for your participation, and the Center for Teaching and Learning looks forward to working with you in the following year to best serve our students.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here today. I'm Dr. Sandra Ramsey, Director of Enrollment Services, and chair of the DEI Strategic Action Planning Committee. Although the term microaggressions was first coined by Harvard professor Chester Pierce in the late 1970s, the topic of microaggressions has only recently become a thing, and I am thrilled to see the college continue this important discussion that I started on campus in 2020 when I first presented on community college freshman perceptions of in-class microaggressions and their intent to persist during Black History Month last year. I also want to thank President Miles, who couldn't be here today, but who sends her regards, senior leadership, and the college community for their continued support of diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus, and of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion's collaborative initiatives that continue throughout the year. Your support is paramount to the continued success of the college and our ability to ensure that all our members are valued and have a seat at the table. Dr. Miles continues to place heightened importance on DEI initiatives at WCC through not only her communications on the matter over the academic year, but also through programs like Achieving the Dream and her influential role in the PepsiCo Scholarship, both of which have a central focus on equitable student success outcomes. In addition, our Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Bernardo Reddick, has worked collaboratively throughout the campus to examine and institute equitable policies, advance and promote DEI initiatives, and to value all members of our community. Finally, I would like to highlight 5 exciting DEI outcomes that occurred during this past academic year. 1, development of DEI action teams, which focus on strategic areas that are critical to the college's success and which include affirmative action and DEI strategic plan committees. 2, the development by the Faculty Senate's Diversity Committee of comprehensive recommendations for DEI best practices in the classroom. 3, the development by the DEI Diversity Statement Team of a revised institutional diversity statement, which has been incorporated throughout our institution and which includes the placement on every class, course outline, and syllabus. 4, recommendations and requirements to support DEI initiatives campus-wide, including cultural competency trainings, which were recommended, required DEI best practices in the classroom, and a recommended campus climate survey. And finally, the Student Government Association's development and approval of various legislation that are founded around sound DEI principles. So thank you so much. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Bernardo Reddick.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. And thank you, Dr. Ramsey, for that brief synopsis in terms of the amazing work that a lot of you and us have been doing throughout the academic year as it relates to DEI principles on this campus. We have a lot of work to do, but the good thing is we have wonderful and amazing partners such as yourself who are here to ensure that we have every person on this campus to have value, to be able to have success in the things that they do, and be able to walk away from the institution knowing that they were part of something amazing. The presentation that we have today from Dr. Woods is very important, and it's in a conversation, again, that we've had many times on this campus, but it's even more critical now as we think about the era we're in and things that have been happening here in our local society. And so I encourage you to have an open mind. I encourage you to listen and really engage and think about some of the things that our presenter is talking about today. We look forward to the discussion after his presentation. And if there's anything you ever need, always feel free to reach out to all the wonderful partners we have on campus because we are here to support you to be as successful as you need to be. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you all so much. I'm now pleased to introduce to you Dr. J. Luke Wood. Dr. J. Luke Wood is a Vice President of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity and Dean's Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University. Dr. Wood also serves as the co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, a national research and practice center that partners with community colleges to support their capacity in advancing outcomes for underserved students of color. Dr. Wood's research on factors affecting the success of boys and men of color in education with specific focus on early childhood education and community colleges. His research examines social, psychological, academic, environmental, institutional contributors to positive outcomes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. J. Luke Wood.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and very much been looking forward to this important conversation. So today we're going to be talking about microaggressions, and we're going to be talking about how they influence the experience of our students and how they influence their success, but also looking at the effect that they have on our students in terms of their racial identities, in terms of their emotional well-being and security, and then thinking about what are some strategies and practices that we can use that can help us to better address these issues. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I'm very excited to be here, very excited to be able to have this conversation with you. And I'm going to go ahead and share screen and let me know if you can't see it. Okay. So I want to begin this conversation, like I do with most, really talking about what equity is. Because ultimately, when we're having a conversation about microaggressions or any other topic that's related, we want to understand how it relates to the success of our students. And so when we think about equity, we see equity as referring to a heightened focus on groups that experience disproportionate impact in order to remediate disparities in their experiences and their outcomes. So when we look at this, there's a few key words that you can see that pop out. One is equity, right, which is what the definition is about. And then there's disproportionate impact. Disproportionate impact refers to when we have groups that have outcomes that are lower than that of their peers. So let's say that we're looking at overall graduation rates. And we see that for our African-American students, our Latinx students, and our Pell eligible students, you can see on the right-hand side of your screen examples of those that we oftentimes find that experience this disproportionate impact. They can have outcomes that are lower than that of their peers. And there's lots of different ways to make sense as to why this occurs. One way is to think that it has something to do with the students, their families, and their communities, and to externalize the rationale for what's occurring, to see it as a focus on inadequacies in student preparation, a lack of apathy in their communities when it comes to education, lack of resilience or grit when it comes to persevering through enormous challenges. And that is one way that is commonly thought of when people think about, all right, so what is the reason why these outcome disparities are occurring? But from our perspective, an equity-minded perspective, our initial focus isn't to look at the students, their families, or their communities, but to say, what are we doing or not doing as an institution that's resulting in the outcome disparities that we see? And so that's why this definition here focuses on remediating disparities in their experiences and their outcomes, not in them. And that really involves us looking in the mirror and thinking about our institutions and what we're doing to produce it. Now, Estella Ben-Simone, who has been very formative in my own kind of way of thinking about these issues, has said that there's 4 primary things that make up what it means to be an equity-minded educator. The first is that we have to recognize the ways in which systemic inequities serve to disadvantage minoritized people in a range of social institutions. It can be in education, employment, healthcare, the criminal injustice system. And so there's systemic inequities that lead to some of the outcome disparities that we see. Now, what's really important here is that an inequity in one system can serve to amplify an inequity in another system. So for example, an inequity in employment, let's say that you are either underemployed or unemployed, can have an impact on the quality of healthcare that you're able to receive. Similarly, we all know that in education, there's a phrase that we oftentimes use called the school to prison pipeline. And that's this understanding that an inequity in education, particularly in K-12 education as it relates to suspensions, expulsions, referrals, leads to inequities in the criminal justice system. The second is that, again, going back to the original point, that we reframe our outcome disparities as an indication of institutional underperformance rather than student underperformance. And we focus on that rather than perceived deficits of students. And then lastly, that we critically reflect upon our own roles. And this critical reflection is important when we're talking about a concept such as microaggressions. And here's why. Oftentimes when we think about what it takes for a student to be successful and we bring in professional learning, we're focused on effective and engaging practices. In fact, it's very common, especially with the work that my colleague Frank and I do on Men of Color, for me to be invited to a campus and for that invitation to specifically involve them wanting to have a crib sheet, like say, hey, can you give us some bullet points on what it takes to teach, say, Black males or Latinx males? And ultimately, it's not about thinking about the effective and engaging pedagogies first, or even relationship building, but our perceptions, how we view our students and how we view our own roles as educators, and thinking about what that means for us. And then the other part of this that's not embedded within her description of this, but has been added by my colleague Frank, is holding one another accountable. Because ultimately, if we see that there are individuals within our institution who aren't rising to the values that we espouse, then we have a responsibility to be able to do something different. And now there's different types of biases that influence a conversation like this. One that we're not necessarily focused on today are explicit biases, right? Now, explicit biases are the overt and intentional beliefs that negatively view, characterize, or engage others. And these biases can be self-reported as being consciously held by the victim. So this is by the individual. So this is a situation where somebody has bias, they know that they're biased, and they're comfortable with that. It may even be part of their own identity. They consciously hold it. And we see examples of how this plays out on many college campuses through flyers that specifically target different people groups, through organizations that want to host events on our campus. I know, for example, my campus has had a history of different white supremacist organizations that have wanted to hold recruitment meetings on our campus, right? Obviously, that's not something that we support. But it also translates into what can be hate incidents and hate crimes on campus. Now, there's lots of different examples as to what this could include. It could include a student being called the N-word. It could be swastikas or other imagery like that on campus. And we've seen a significant increase in this across the country, where there have been numerous institutions that have seen a rise in hate incidents and hate crimes. But we're really not, when we're thinking about implicit bias, talking about these types of issues. We're really thinking about the more subtle ways in which racism plays out, and that's through implicit bias. Now, on your screen, there are two different definitions and one description. I'm going to read the first one, but as I read through it, I want you to be looking at these collectively and identify, are there any words or key phrases that stand out in your mind here? So the first is from the Kirwan Institute. This is one of my favorite definitions, and it says that implicit bias is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an implicit manner, activated involuntarily, without awareness or intentional control. It can be either positive or negative, and it says that everyone is susceptible. Doesn't say that some people are susceptible or that most people are, but that all of us are. And so take a moment here, look at your screen, and then in the chat window, if there are words or phrases on this screen that that either stand out to you in some way or help to encapsulate in your mind what implicit bias is, I want you to go ahead and take a moment and put those in the chat. I'm going to start to monitor it as it comes up. Okay, yes, great already. Involuntarily, lots of folks identifying that, activated involuntarily. And so that is a key component, because with implicit bias, there's not necessarily, and this brings us to our first big point, we have to separate intent from impact, because there's not necessarily an intent to do something negative, right? And in fact, when people convey microaggressions, they can also do so, and oftentimes do so, with a positive intent. So here's an example of that. Someone says to a person of color, "Oh, wow, you're so articulate," with a sense of surprise. Now, in their mind, they think that they are complimenting the person, that they are saying something positive to them. But in reality, they aren't, because the sense of surprise that's associated with it sends an underlying message that they didn't think they would be as smart as they would be. So, for example, you can have a positive intent. Wow, you're so articulate, which says I didn't think that you would be. Or I didn't expect you to know that, which says that I may not think that you are academically or cognitively capable. Or walking up to a student on campus at nighttime to ask for their ID. It's not asking for their ID, it's the underlying assumption that they may have been there to steal something, right? And so those are some key words that come out. You've also pointed out traces of past experience, and that is on that second definition, second line, very first few letters, traces of past experience. That's a really key point that we're absolutely going to come back to, so please keep that in your mind. It talks, some of you have indicated that it can either be positive or negative, which is interesting, right? But when we think about stereotypes, it works like this. There are some groups that we hold with greater esteem. We think that they are more intelligent, that they're more capable, that they're more moral. And there's then less other groups that we see as the exact opposite, that they're less intelligent, less capable, less moral. And so you can have biases that esteem certain groups, that raise them up, and then with other groups that draw them down and think of them and characterize them in a negative way. And ultimately, some of you have also indicated that it motivates our actions, right? Which is one of the big points that we have to keep in mind, because we wouldn't be here if it didn't motivate our actions, right? We're here to have a conversation because it translates into an experience for our students that can be less than ideal. So thank you for pointing those out. Now, this isn't a conversation on implicit bias, but I do want to cover just a couple of very key points. First, we all have bias, but we're more likely to communicate that bias when we're in certain types of conditions. For example, there's been juxtaposed between a system 2 and a system 1 type of thinking. In a system 2 type of thinking, we're being thoughtful about every word that comes out of our mouth and how that word is formed, and our body language and our eye contact if it's culturally appropriate to do so. So it's more controlled, it's higher effort, it's less prone to bias. And ultimately, that's not how most of us engage. Instead, we're responding in the moment because we have all these different things that are going on. We're on this committee and that committee, and we're teaching a class, or we're in student services, and we're doing this and we're doing that. And so it's constantly in response. And so what happens is it's more automatic. It's more efficient, right? I'm not thinking about every word and how that word is formed. I'm communicating that words as they come to me. It's lower effort. It's more prone to bias because my mind fills in the blanks with the difference. And that's where it gets back to that traces of past experiences, where our past experiences influence the ways and messages that we convey to one another. Now, we're not always in situations where we're going to be conveying this bias, but the truth is, if you juxtapose the system 1 and system 2, right, we know that there are certain conditions that are more likely to produce that system 1, and it refers to I, T, and S. Times when we have incomplete information, times when our time is constrained, and third, when we're experiencing stress or insufficient sleep. So let's put that in context in terms of this work from Bertrand and colleagues. They say that it occurs that we're more likely to have an inclination towards our implicit associations about certain individuals and certain groups when we're in situations that involve ambiguous or incomplete information, circumstances in which our time is constrained, or times when our cognitive control is compromised, where we're experiencing stress or insufficient sleep. Now, I want you to take a moment for yourself and think about your Monday, your Tuesday, your Wednesday, your Thursday, your Friday. These conditions, at least for me, typify every single moment of my day. I have oftentimes am given incomplete or ambiguous information. My time is constrained. There's lots of things that are going on as part of my work expectations, and the nature of my job is stressful, right? I think that this is why we see so much work on implicit bias in education, but it's also why we see so much work on implicit bias in healthcare and in policing as well. Because of the nature of these areas, They're oftentimes involved incomplete information. People are constrained with time to make decisions, and the nature of those jobs is stressful. So we all have bias. We're more likely to be using that system one thinking. We're also then more likely to be in these conditions. So then what are we conveying, right? Where do these microaggressions come from? Well, it comes from the primacy effect, or the traces of past experience. Now, the primacy effect refers to the fact that individuals tend to give more weight to information presented earlier when forming an opinion or making a decision. It refers to the fact that individuals tend to give more weight to information presented earlier when forming opinions and making decisions. So we can think about this in all kinds of different ways, and we're going to think about this in a sociological context and how that affects social psychology. But let's first start in a communication or argumentation framework. Many of you may have seen the nightly news, right? Where you have different people who are logging in, and they're going to be talking on a panel on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, whatever news channel you watch. There's probably been at least one point in time where you've seen one of these panels, and they're in the Brady Bunch view where you got the moderator in the center, and they're going to turn to somebody, they're going to ask them a question. And you know that people have really prepared themselves for this moment. You know, they've gotten themselves ready to convey important information to the nation about what is important for that conversation. And then oftentimes you'll see that the person who is moderating will turn to the first person, they'll ask them a question, and then instead of responding directly to the question and directly to the conversation that they're there for, they'll say something that's salacious, something that's out in left field, something that's meant to grab headlines and attention. And then what happens? Do all the people who prepared themselves very carefully for this event then engage in the conversation that the moderator asks? Or do they respond to the statement that was made by this individual? And typically what happens is the conversations get derailed. And that's because in argumentation, the first person to make the argument frames the conversation. And then everything that comes after that is a counter argument to that initial argument. So the primacy effect is absolutely in effect when it comes to debate and argumentation, but it's also in a place when it comes to our socialization. The earliest experiences that we have in our lives with walking through a neighborhood and seeing somebody and being pulled to walk across the other side of the street, or driving through a neighborhood and someone says to roll up the window or lock the door, or you're listening to a station on the radio and somebody says that music is trash music and has negative things to say and characterize it, right? And that music maybe happens to be associated with a people group. Or it can be watching the nightly news. And how many times did we see this? Searching for Black male suspect, searching for Latino male suspect, searching for Black male suspect. And so we can have these images inculcated within our mind. And what the research says is it doesn't have to be overt. It can be very subtle forms of messages that we receive that communicate these values to us. And so that brings us to why we're really here, which is microaggressions. Because ultimately, when we have these implicit biases, we don't hold them within us, we communicate them to one another. So implicit bias and racial microaggressions are very much intertwined. And racial microaggressions refers to brief and commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether they're intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. This is a definition from Gerald Wing Sue. The concept was actually created by Chester Pierce, a Harvard psychologist, but Gerald Wing Sue has done an immense amount of work in recent years in expanding it in psychology, as has Daniel Solorzano in social psychology of education. So lots of work has been done on this. And in fact, I'm sure that many of you could probably give an example of a microaggression that you've heard before, either to yourself or directed towards other people or from different training that you've been through. And so what I would like for you to do is, if there's examples of words or phrases that stand out in your mind, or actions that are an example of a microaggression, I want you to just put them into the chat window. Now, again, I gave you a few examples earlier. One is oh, wow, you're so articulate, said with a sense of surprise, which communicates an underlying message, or I didn't expect you to know that, right? So those are two examples, but I want you to take a moment, and as I talk through a few different key points here, I'm going to come back to whatever examples you provide and then connect them to some of the examples that I brought for you as part of this conversation. So again, please use the chat window to populate those. And as I do, here's a couple key points. First, when we think about microaggressions, we can't think about them as being aberrant, and aberrant in the way that it is abnormal. Instead, these are messages that are normal, they're pervasive, and they're part of the daily experiences of our students and our colleagues of color. They're normal. Normal, not meaning good, normal in this case meaning bad, but normal as being regular, routine, routinized. They can be subtle snubs, dismissive looks, and putdowns. They oftentimes invalidate people or they invalidate their experiences. And the research interestingly shows that they can be more psychologically damaging than direct acts of racism. And here's one of the reasons why that occurs. So I'm from a small town in far, 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 far Northern California, just really about 30 minutes south of the Oregon border. And when I grew up, and where I grew up, I was one of the only two African Americans in my school. My twin brother was the other one. And we grew up in a place where it was very direct. And so there wouldn't be a day that as a child that I wouldn't be called either the N-word or cottonhead or some other type of racial epithet as a very regular experience in my daily life. But for me, I knew what box to put that in. Like if there was a young boy who called me the N-word, I knew, okay, well, I'm not inviting him to the birthday party because I know what box that he fits in. He fits in this little R racism box. I'm going to set that to the side and then focus on those who I know care about me and care about my success. But microaggressions are more subtle than this, right? And because they're more subtle, oftentimes what happens is what's called attribution ambiguity, where the recipient is unclear or hazy about what occurred. Did that really occur? Is that what they really said? Am I misunderstanding? And it can be very difficult when that occurs. And so that's why some scholars such as Gloria Ladson-Billings and others have referred to it as 1,000 daily cuts because it's like a cut and a cut and a cut and a cut. And they add up over time, and then they can have an effect on us and our well-being. Again, with microaggressions, it isn't about what's said, right? Because it can have a good intent, but still have a bad impact. It is not about what's said, it's about what's really said. So what's said is, wow, you're so articulate. What's really said is, I didn't think that you would be. So on your screen are examples of what's really said. And the messages that are communicated are that you're different from us. You don't belong here. That you're not intelligent or capable. The people of color are lazy and they don't care. That you're being too sensitive. That you're a criminal, you're dangerous, you're not of worth, or it can invalidate your experiences with racism, or racism doesn't exist, or playing the race card, or things that basically serve to dilute the experience that someone has. And so, again, separating intent from impact, this allows us, as we see these examples, to be more thoughtful about what we communicate. It also brings me to a second key point that I want to communicate to you. The first being separating intent from impact, and the second point being that being biased doesn't make you bad. Going back all the way here to this definition, you can see that it says that everyone is susceptible. So all of us have bias, right? So let's not assess it as a negative thing. It's not about whether the bias is bad because we all hold it. We all have been socialized in a biased environment. But once you have been exposed to the fact that we all have biases, then we have a responsibility to do something different, right? So being biased doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. But then knowing that you have bias and choosing not to do anything about it, that's what's bad. So I'm going to look at the chat window here and see some different examples that you may have shared. And as I do so, what I'm going to do is talk about, I'm so glad, lots of great examples here. I want to talk about how they relate to these individual types of microaggressions. Oh wow, scrolling up farther, even more than I thought. You speak well is an example. You speak well is an example of an ascription of intelligence, because it's an assumption that you would not. It says, you're so blank for a blank. You're maybe so smart for a Black girl, as an example, right? That's what we call different norming, because what you do is you're complimenting a person, but at the same time drawing down their community. Or, wow, did you write as well as you speak, is an ascription of intelligence, especially when said with a sense of surprise. You're too blank for a Puerto Rican, right? Again, going back through the examples of different norming. These are great examples, by the way. Where are you from? Where are you really from? Is what we call alien and own land. And that is an assumption that people of color are not likely to be from the United States, that they're otherized in some way. Or that you speak English so well is another example of alien and own land. But what are you can certainly be an alien owned land or another type of negative characterization. How long have you been here? Do you speak Spanish? Right? These are other examples that we can see. I'm not gonna go through all these, but I think you're getting the idea. You clearly have a lot of examples of these. So we will certainly spend our time talking about microaggressions, but given the level of understanding that I see you have, I also did now want us to spend, I'll get to the end earlier so we can actually spend time engaging in some case studies around what we can do about this as well. So just a few key ones that I really want to highlight and point out. The first is an ascription of intelligence. This is when we assign a degree of intelligence based upon race. So based upon a person's identity, their racial identity, we assign a degree of intelligence based on that. It can be, examples can be a phone call. And these are some examples directly from the Zoom environment where the professor called me about a week after I submitted my paper. She said, wow, you wrote this? They were shocked that I could write. And again, it's not the compliment itself, it's the compliment when it comes from a place of surprise. And oftentimes people don't necessarily recognize that they are conveying a sense of surprise when it comes to these issues. Or a Zoom breakout room. In my Zoom breakout group, I answered a question. Then one of the men in the class says, you're smart for a Black girl. See if there's any examples, other examples that you have that you would like to share. I'm looking in the chat window, see if there are any other examples of ascriptions. And I know you've provided some already, so feel free to just repost any other examples that come to your mind. You sound educated. Are you a teacher? Yes, that's a very good example. He's really intelligent about a student of color, right? But of course, the notion of there has to be an associated sense of surprise that goes along with that. Okay, assumption of criminality is another big one we see. This is oftentimes what we and my colleagues refer to as distrust, and it assumes that a person of color is dangerous, criminal, or deviant based on their race. Here's some examples that we see. An email response. I wrote the professor to let him know I wasn't able to attend class because the internet was down. He wrote back very condescendingly, insinuating that I was lying. And the student kind of exclaimed and said, you know, lots of people are having internet problems right now because they felt like they were being singled out for this issue. Or a Zoom breakout room. I have to be honest. When I'm alone at night, there are times when I worry about being assaulted by a Black or Latino male. It's not that I'm racist. It's just a gut feeling that I need to protect myself.
Hello, good morning.
The other example that is on their screen is, I want you to read that last one. Latinx students are more likely to plagiarize on their papers. It's not that they're not smart, it's just that they don't understand the language. And this brings me to another key point about microaggressions, is that they can be interrelated. So for example, an ascription of intelligence and an assumption of criminality can go hand in hand. One example that comes to my mind is an experience that my twin brother had. So we went off to college at Sacramento State, and he was going into a Spanish class. And he'd taken multiple years of Spanish in high school. He had done the absolute best that he could, but he did not satisfy the foreign language requirement. There was still more that needed to be done. And so what happened is that he walked into the class, he was asked to take an exam. And I remember him taking the exam and calling me afterwards, called me on the phone. He's like, Luke, I did so well on this exam. I think that the teacher is going to tell me that I should challenge the class, that I don't really need to be in this class. And so what happened was he went back to the next class session, and she started handing out the papers to all the different students in the class. And his came back with just a sign on the top saying, come see me in my office. And so he called me afterwards, like, yo, Luke, that she knows it. She can tell that I don't belong in this class. This is so exciting. And so he went to go see her in her office. So once he did, she had another faculty member standing outside of her office. Actually, I said faculty member, I meant her husband, who was standing outside her office, but almost like they were standing guard. It was like a really weird situation. And so it threw him off at first, like, oh, why is he here? So he walks inside, she hands him his paper and says, we don't know how you did this, but we're pretty sure that you cheated on this exam. And so we want you to retake the exam right now. So on the spot, with no forewarning, asked him to retake the exam. And so he was flustered, he was frustrated, had been accused of cheating, but he's like, okay, well, whatever. So he sits there and he retakes the exam. Faculty member then does this. She goes through, and he's in the same office as her taking this exam. She's done, and then basically picks up the exam. She's grading it, and shaking her head. And then she looks at him, she turns to him and she says, I don't know how you've done this a second time, but I'm not gonna tolerate cheating in my class. And on both exams, he had scored an A, and she gave him an F on the exam for cheating. Now, this may sound like an extreme incident or an isolated incident, but I come to you today to tell you that it is not. And in my experience, collecting data with my colleague Frank Harris across hundreds of community colleges, we have never seen an institution where that hasn't been a theme that emerged from the experiences of students of color. Whether it's an exam, a test, a project, a demonstration, it's what happens when people of color outperform low expectations. And so this brings me to another key point that I wanted to convey to you today. Just remember that no one has ever risen to low expectations. And so our belief should be in the students and in the quality of the work that they do. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a student say to me that they put all kinds of effort and energy into doing a paper. And it was the first time that they had really spent the time and attention, and they were really just trying to do the right thing. And then the immediate response from the faculty was to accuse them of cheating, and just how deflated they felt when that occurred. And I see that in the chat window that there are other examples that are being put in. Thank you so much for sharing these as really good examples as well. Second-class citizenship rounds out what we call the D3 effect: distrust, disdain, and disregard. So distrust was that assumption of criminality, which we just talked about. Disdain refers to second-class citizenship, and disregard was the inscriptions of intelligence that we started with. So second-class citizenship is when we treat a person of color as if they're lesser than in comparison to a non-person of color. And here's some examples on your screen that you can see here: responding to a discussion post from a white male student and ignoring those posts from students of color. or a Zoom engagement. You have to raise your virtual hand in Zoom to get called on, but it feels like she never calls on me. It's like I don't exist. Or another example. So apparently the professor has been reaching out to students to check in on them, but he's only doing it with his favorite students. All of us Black students know that means he's not contacting us anytime soon. The other example of this that I see very commonly is at the campus bookstore or campus eateries, when there's a person of color who's standing in line and the person who's at the counter calls on the person behind them, assuming that for some reason that they're not there to be served. And oftentimes it's a misunderstanding, a mistake, but it is based upon biases, and it does serve to shape people's perceptions. Or it can be the assumption that that if you are on campus and you're a student who's a student of color, that you must be there because you're a custodian or food service worker. Now, let me be clear. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being a custodian or food service worker. What's wrong is the assumption that you are simply because you're a person of color. And so I want to delineate that because I think that's an important point there. Pathologizing culture is another one. And you've provided some examples of that, but I think about it as the they statements, that they're lazy, that they don't care, that they're not really here for school, that they'll be gone by census, that they're only here for the financial aid. So it's when we pathologize a culture, a value system, a communication style for our students in ways that negatively affect them and characterize them. And you're right, some of these don't sound very micro. I think it depends upon the manner in which they're being communicated. If the intent is to put down, and the intent is to put down for a racialized way, then it's more explicit bias. But if the intent is more unconscious and more informed by implicit bias, then it tends to be more microaggressions, though there is a subtype of microaggression that is explicit. I'm gonna go through these other ones just really quickly because I want to get to how this affects our students, because I think that's an important part for us to have in this conversation. So different norming is the examples, and again, you had given some really clear examples of this that were really important. Assuming and having the authority to negatively characterize or uncharacterize and categorize people of color. So it's what we call the compliments and the disses at the same time. When I was talking about those Blacks, I wasn't really talking about you, or I don't think of you as Asian. You're different. You're not like the rest of them. You work hard. Why can't all minorities be like you, right? And what this is when you compliment a student, but you do so in tearing down their community that they come from. So you say to a Latinx student, wow, you're so articulate, you do work so well. Why can't the others who come from your community be more like you, right? It separates them from their community. It's a negative characterization of their community and their families. And so it's important to keep that in mind as another example of this. The one that lots of people have a struggle with, though, is colorblindness. And colorblindness refers to the denial or pretense that a white person does not see color or race. When you say things like, I don't see color, or I treat all my students the same, or America is a melting pot. There's only one race, the human race, or race is only as important as we make it, right? We can think of lots of examples in which this plays out. Here's why this is a microaggression. Because what someone is typically trying to say is not what's being said. What they're trying to say is that I was raised to treat everyone with dignity and humanity. I was raised to be respectful towards all of the individuals that I engage. That's what individuals think that they're saying in their minds. But what's really being said is that I don't see your color. I don't see your race. I don't see what makes you you. And for a person like me, for example, I'm African-American. Being Black is one of the important elements of my identity. I embrace it. It's something that I'm proud of. So when someone says that they don't see me or they don't see color, they're saying that they don't see me. And then the myth of meritocracy is the last one I'll cover here. And this is just this notion that the students who work the hardest, the people who do the best, are the ones that work the hardest. And it ignores the fact that we are on different playing fields. And in fact, I would say this, many of you have probably seen the images of equity versus equality, right? Where there's the baseball field and people are standing on different boxes, and one group has they can see over the fence and another group can't see over the fence, and so there has to be differential boxes to help to remediate that disparity. Or you've seen the one with the tree where they're trying to pick fruit from the tree, and they need different size ladders, right? What it's really trying to get at is that there is a differential playing ground that our students come from. Our students of color, our students who struggle with food insecurities, housing insecurities, transportation concerns, employment barriers. And because of those differential grounds that we start from, it's this notion that the people who work the hardest are the ones that do the best, when in reality, that's not necessarily true. People can work hard and still not be able to experience the same types of life opportunities and success based upon privilege and based upon differential experiences. So here's some examples. If minorities would just work harder, they could be just as successful as whites and Asians. Or when my grandparents immigrated from Europe, no one gave them anything. They were too poor, but they worked hard to buy a home, to start a business. If they can do it, anybody can. And these are notions that have elements of truth. Absolutely. I'm sure that this person's grandparents did come as immigrants and were poor. I'm sure that they did have to work hard. But just because they had to work hard didn't mean that their race was one of the things that made it harder for them to have to overcome. And so that's where this differential understanding comes into place. Now, I've talked a lot about microaggressions, but I think it's important to stop and think about, how does this affect the students that we work with and that we care about, right? Because ultimately, these messages affect student success, but let's think about how they affect student success. And one way is through what is called race lighting. On your screen, you can see a copy of a scholarly brief that we've written on race lighting, and the link on the bottom, you can go to the bmmcoalition.com/race lighting and get a copy of this. Definitely would encourage everyone to read it. And essentially, what race lighting is when we gaslight people of color. And essentially what it comes down to is when someone's experiences, when their realities, when their memories, when their judgment is questioned in a way that makes them begin to second guess themselves or doubt themselves. So what I'd like for you to do is just listen to me. I have a narrative on the screen. I realize that it's long, but I want to just read this to you because I think it helps to inculcate in our minds what this is. And I'm taking it out of a higher education, post-secondary education context and giving you an example of what this looks like in kindergarten, so you can see how these implicit biases and microaggressions lead to race lighting. And again, as you think about race lighting, think about the experience that someone would have where they would begin to doubt themselves or feel disoriented. So it's the doubt and disorientation that comes from these experiences. So I'm going to read this, and I want you to just listen and think about how this plays out in all different levels of education. Jacob is a young Black boy who is entering kindergarten. At first, he's excited for a new school year as he enjoyed his time in preschool. This excitement is made even more special by the fact that Jacob has several preschool friends who will be in his class in kindergarten. Jacob's teacher, Miss Andrews, struggles with managing the students in her classroom. Within weeks of school beginning, Jacob's excitement and demeanor begin to change. Miss Andrews regularly says negative comments about Jacob in front of the other children. She asks Jacob to read aloud and criticizes him harshly for every error. She tells the children to line up and points out that Jacob is out of line. And she yells at Jacob for tapping his pencil while she's talking. In all cases, all the other children make the same mistakes and errors. However, Jacob's are amplified and made into a larger deal. Miss Andrews uses Jacob as an example of what not to be, how not to act, and how not to learn. She does so to show other children that they don't want to be like Jacob, a message that gives her a greater sense of control over her classroom. And in her mind, she cares about her students. And this is a way of demonstrating to her students important behavioral norms. She also sends home notes regularly regarding Jacob's behavior and even puts him in an in-school suspension for throwing a rock at a fence with a group of boys who are also doing the same thing. Jacob was the only one reprimanded for that incident and was characterized to his parents as a troublemaker. Jacob, here we go. Here's the race lighting part. Jacob starts to second guess himself, beginning to believe that he is a bad kid. Though he doesn't have the capacity yet to describe his feelings, Jacob doesn't believe that school is a place for him. He doesn't see himself as a smart person like the other children are. Jacob's parents experience these feelings even more intensely. With so many notes and messages from Ms. Andrews regarding his behavior, they begin to doubt their own effectiveness as parents. They begin to second guess their efforts to prepare him academically. They also begin to question whether or not Jacob is indeed a troublemaker. And so this is an example of how this plays out in early learning. And I provide this example so that you can see how these things can be amplified and how these things can be intensified in these times. Now, I'm going to skip ahead here and just go straight to this definition. So race lighting is a process whereby people of color begin to question their own thoughts and actions due to systematically delivered racialized messages that make them second guess their own lived experiences and realities with racism. And because of the ways in which there are racialized messages that kind of co-align or coalesce, they tend to be around distrust, disdain, and disregard. And so a student can feel that they are academically inferior or criminal or less worthy. And because of the pervasiveness and veracity of these messages coming from multiple faculty members, multiple staff members, multiple community members, it can lead to an individual second guessing their experiences, their feelings, their capabilities, their knowledge, their decision-making, their recollections, and even their basic humanity. And so when you think about race lighting, think about it like this. When someone gets to the point where they're saying to themselves, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. That doubt, that disorientation, that's race lighting. Now, race lighting can also be intensified when it's intersectional. So for example, as a Black male, I have one experience, but let's say that a person comes from multiple minoritized groups, right? Let's say that they're a woman of color who happens to be part of the LGBT community, right? Now there's 3 identities there that are minoritized. It can produce even more intensified experiences with these issues. And so that's important to keep in mind. Now, this also leads to a concept called racial battle fatigue. And this is where we even think further about how this influences students and student success. So racial battle fatigue comes from the work of William Smith, and it's a framework for making sense of the cognitive, emotional, and physiological effects of being a person of color in environments that are either implicitly racist or explicitly racist. And now, if you haven't read any of the work of William Smith, absolutely encourage you to do so. He's done amazing work looking at this concept. And essentially what he's been able to show is that if you're in an environment that is racist, right, whether it's explicit racism or even these subtle forms of racism, that it has an effect on you because you are in what is called mundane extreme environmental stress. Mundane extreme environmental stress. And it can lead to an experience that is akin to combat stress syndrome, where because of the environment, because it is an unsafe environment, you can have a mental, emotional, and physiological injury that comes from it that's akin to what you would see with some of the effects of combat stress syndrome. So there can be a physiological effect. So think about it like this. Our students can have headaches and backaches. They can have an elevated heartbeat. Faculty member asks them a question in class and they have to answer and everybody's looking at them and they're having an elevated heartbeat, not because of just answering the question, but because there's a stereotype that about them and their lack of intelligence. And if they answer that question wrong, they can have stereotype threat. And so there's a physiological effect that can come from that. It can be an upset stomach, or extreme fatigue, a loss of appetite. And we see this especially in early childhood, preschool through third grade. The young child who says, I don't want to go to school, my stomach hurts, is the perfect example of what racial battle fatigue looks like. It affects our students of color. It affects our faculty of color. It affects our staff of color. It is a physiological effect from being in these environments. But it's not just physiological, it's also, as we know, psychological as well. It can be constant worrying and anxiety, an inability to be able to sleep. A loss of confidence is probably one of the big ones that we should focus on. Hypervigilance, frustration. So what I'd like for you to do is to think about this. When we are in situations where we see these issues occur in our classrooms or in our offices or in any situation that involves our students, we have to keep in mind that there is a real effect on our students and their success. It affects their confidence. It affects their resilience. It affects their belief in the usefulness of school. It affects their focus in school. It affects them physiologically. And that, I think we can all agree, is not an environment that is conducive to supporting their success. And so we oftentimes offer the Raven approach as a way for thinking about what can we do to address this. So the Raven was developed by my colleague, Frank Harris, and I, as a way of thinking about how we can respond to microaggressions when they occur. And that's because microaggressions will absolutely occur in our classrooms. They will absolutely be part of the experiences of our students. And so it's important for us to be keeping it in mind what that experience can look like for some of our students as they experience these microaggressions. And so the first thing that we want to do is that when we're in a situation where we see this occur, let's say that we're in a classroom and or in an office and there's a conversation going on and someone says that those students, that they come from a bad community, right? A bad community. And it's said in a way that denigrates that community. Well, I want us to think about the fact that harm has been done, right? Especially think about there might be a student from that very community in that environmental setting. So the first thing that we want to do is to redirect. We want to either intervene by interjecting immediately and redirecting the conversation. We want to, if it's a really obvious thing that's occurred, we want to correct. If it's done privately, we want to pull people aside. But whatever we want to do, we have to redirect, and here's why. If we don't redirect, then we are allowing harm to occur. Because we can't kid ourselves. In all the examples that I've just given, harm has been done. And in reality, most people, when they convey a microaggression, they don't say, oh, I'm sorry I did that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'm glad you did so, and they move on. That's not what usually happens, is that people become embarrassed and they either try to cover it up or they are worried that they might be perceived as having done something that's racist and they dig in. And so they might even accuse you of offending them for bringing it to their attention, or they might become defensive. So we have to intercede because harm has been done. The second thing we have to do is ask probing questions. So we are in an educational institution. The most powerful thing that we have in our toolkit is the power of the question and the question why. You know, when I heard you say that they come from a bad community, can you tell me what you mean by bad? And let them explain. And maybe they'll have a really good reason that's different from what you thought. But for the most part, that's not true. And it's an opportunity to be able to do that. So asking a question. So I think I heard you say X. What did you mean by that? Or I want to make sure that I understand what you're saying. Were you saying that? Whatever it might be. Then the third thing that you want to do is what's called values clarification. In every single educational setting, there's a set of values that guides that environment. So that value system may be the mission statement of the college or university. It may be in a classroom environment, the syllabus and ground rules for engagement. It may be a departmental mission. Whatever it is, sometimes it's posted on the wall, sometimes it's in a document, but whatever the individuals within that social environment would readily assume is related to that environment, that's what you want to go with. And you want to say, for example, you know, in this department, we work to create a space that's safe and welcoming for all of our students. And, or what you just said is inconsistent or disaligned with our values that prioritize diversity and inclusion, whatever it might be. You want to point to that standard, a standard that everyone will understand. The next thing that you can do is emphasize your own thoughts and feelings. You know, when I heard you say that comment, I think that individuals from that, you know, I think the individuals from that community could be hurt by what you said, because it could assume that they are, you know, unable to do what they need to be able to do, right? That they are incapable. Or many people may take this to mean this, or in my experience. So you're putting it in language that's harder for them to be able to put down because it's your own opinion and your perception. And then the last thing that you want to do is offer next steps. So in the future, what can you do, right? In the future, you know, I want you to be more thoughtful about the words you say. So let me put it all together in an example in a classroom environment. And then we're going to go to an extreme example that is not in a classroom environment. So you're in a classroom environment, there's a conversation, and there's an area of town called, let's say it's called Eastlake. It's like, oh, we all know the people who come from Eastlake, that's a bad community. You know, there's lots of crime and it's a dangerous community, right? And so you know that there's students in your class who might be from Eastlake. And so someone said this, and this could be hurtful to them. So you're a faculty member, and your response could be, well, you know, let me stop you there. I'm redirecting. Because you just said that individuals who come from Eastlake, that's a bad community. So when you say the word bad, what do you mean by bad? Now you're asking a probing question. You're giving them the opportunity to say something different, to do something different. And in some cases, some people will walk it back. They'll recognize that what they said was offensive, and they'll do something different. And let's just say in this case, they recognize it, and they say, you know, I'm sorry, everybody, I shouldn't have said that. What I'm trying to say is X. Then you allow them to self-correct, and the situation is over, right? Or let's just say that they dig in. It's like, oh yeah, it's a bad community. You know, there's lots of people of color who live there, or something that just like digs in. Or, you know, we all know that's bad, just watch the nightly news. That's when you go to the next part. So, you know, when you say bad, I just want you to know that we work to create an environment in this class that's safe and welcoming for all of our students. That's values clarification. So I want you to know that when I hear those comments, it hurts my heart, because I know that there's people from that community who may be hurt by what you said. So next steps. So in the future, I just like you to be more thoughtful about what you say, so we can create an environment that's welcoming for all of our students. Now, I just gave it to you as the Raven approach, the R, the A, the V, the E, the N. But in reality, it's not always every single one of these steps. Sometimes it's just a redirect and ask probing questions and next steps. Sometimes it's just values clarification. Ultimately, it's not about the Raven approach. It's about this, that we do something, that we say something, because the worst thing we can do is to do nothing and allow harm to manifest and perpetuate an environment that's supposed to be safe and welcoming for all of our students. Now, I want to give you another example here. I want to make sure that you can see scenario 3. Can you see scenario 3 on your screen? Okay, so I'm going to read this. This is an example in a student services context. And I want to give you this example because this is actually a true situation that really occurred. And I want you to think about how you would respond to this using the Raven approach. Okay, so here we go. 3 staff members are in the financial aid office. One person named Karen overhears her colleagues Rachel and Kevin chatting informally. Rachel has just assisted a Cambodian student who's been having some trouble completing her paperwork. Rachel became impatient and frustrated because of the time required to assist the student. As Rachel walked away from the counter, she looks at Kevin, rolls her eyes, and says, "I don't know why students like her are here. She can barely speak English. There's no way she can pass a class. She's probably just here for the financial aid anyhow." Kevin laughed and said in response, "Yeah, I know. What a waste of money. She'll be gone by census." Now, Kevin and Rachel laugh because from their perspective and from the perspective of others who are watching them, they think that this is a joke. So now this isn't very subtle, admittedly, right? This wasn't a subtle example, but I want you to think about it for a moment now. Using the Raven approach, how would you respond to this situation? How would you redirect? How would you ask probing questions? How would you clarify values? What would you do to emphasize your own thoughts and feelings? What would you recommend as next steps? And so you can either unmute yourself or you can use the chat window. Just love to hear any thoughts that you have. If you put it in the chat, I'll make sure to read it out. And if it's an example of a redirect, just put redirect in front of it. If it's an example of asking a probing question, just put that in front of it. But what I think is important for us to do is to start giving ourselves examples of what this looks like, so we can start getting in the practice of responding to these issues when they occur. Because again, we know this has a direct effect on the success of our students in the environment that we're creating for our students. Someone says, tell Rachel and Kevin not to laugh as a way of redirecting. Yeah, and that could be a good way of redirecting. Hey, I see you guys laughing about this, or I see you both laughing about this. I don't think that's very funny. That'd be a great way to redirecting in this particular situation. The other person says, I would ask them both, what do you mean by that? And make them explain. So that's asking a probing question. So what did they mean by that statement? Someone said that they would focus on values clarification, talking about the values of their department and how that relates to what they should or should not be saying. Or someone would say, well, you know, in this department, we work to create a space that's safe and welcoming for our students. Another person says, I would go with values clarification and state how their comments make me feel. You know, when I hear so values clarification and emphasizing thoughts and feelings is what they're saying here. So, you know, in this department, we work to create an environment that's safe and welcoming for all our students. So when I hear you say this, I have to say that it hurts me, right? So, that's an example of what someone could say. Here's someone who says, ask a probing question. What do you mean when you say that they will not pass? Someone says that they would do values clarification, emphasizing the mission of the college. That's a great example of what to do. Someone says, in my experience, many students who are not fluent in English are very motivated and work extra hard in order to learn and not do well. And you could use that as a way of redirecting, right? Or you could use that as emphasizing your own thoughts and feelings. You could use that in both contexts there. Someone says, say, I don't know about that. I've had a lot of great students who are still developing their language proficiency. And then the last example that I'll read is someone says, well, you could pull them aside and ask, what do you mean when you say that it was a waste of money to support this student? When you say that helping the student pursue their education is a waste of money, that does not go along with our commitment to access to higher education for all students. That's a beautiful example of what you could say in this particular situation. Now, I'm going to give you one other thing to think about here. And that is, if we know that Rachel engaged this student in this way, we also know that we need to intervene with Rachel and Kevin, and probably need to report this to somebody. But even more so, I think that we have a responsibility to walk out and follow that student and find that student and make sure that they got all the support that they needed. Because if Rachel was making jokes like this about the student, and you could see that Rachel was noticeably frustrated and impatient, what kind of experience did that student have? And let's think about it. Financial aid is part of the matriculation process. So this might even be this student's one of their first experiences in the institution before they've ever even hit a classroom. And it's framed their experience on campus, that this is not a place where I will belong. This is not a place that I will be valued. This is not a place that's good for me. And then the last example I see is in terms of next steps. When you meet a student like that, suggest that they use academic support to help them with English. So just remember that there's opportunities. And in fact, I would just say that maybe this student is on campus because they're there to take English classes, right? Which can be oftentimes provided by many of our institutions as an example. So it's a way for us to just think differently about what we should do. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing screen, and I just want to hear your thoughts, your comments, either in terms of questions that you have or things that I said that really resonated with you. I want us to use this last bit of our time to just hear from you and what you have to say and what you're thinking. And feel free to just unmute and jump in.
It was a great session today. It was the first time I've been to it, but I've done everything on Zoom, and I have something else to do at 12 o'clock, 12:30. But I enjoyed myself today. I just never knew that. I just found out the other day that you were coming on.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you being here.
No problem.
I have a question. I don't know if can you hear me?
Yes, I can very clearly.
I just kept thinking about the context of our classrooms, right? And some practical concerns, or I guess practical questions that I have about how to say something, because what really resonated with me was this idea that I don't know the first experiences that my students had. I don't know what kind, when I get Jacob in my college classroom, I don't know what his kindergarten experience was like. And so, it could be that I say something to him that triggers that awful experience that he had with his teacher. And then I can't figure out why he's offended, but of course, he's had all of those reasons to read me that way.
Yeah.
The first thing I noticed was that I wondered what Jacob's classroom was like, because as I was listening to you read that, the story about him, I was just assuming that his teacher and everyone else in his class was white. And we actually don't know that. So I thought, that was kind of interesting in terms of my own perception that I didn't really examine that until the end. But also, what happens if I have Jacob in my classroom and he's super smart. And I learned this after I give the first quiz and he writes this essay response. And I say, oh my gosh, you were so articulate in that response, or that comment that you just brought up in class, really, really smart. I'm pleasantly surprised because he's a freshman in my class who just demonstrated, some great idea that I didn't know about. But Jacob may read that as me saying, oh, you're so smart, for a Black person, or you're so smart, or you're so articulate. And so then I feel like, do I have to explain that? How do I mitigate that? Because I want to be able to say those affirming things to students. And I don't know if I'm tapping into some kind of microaggression that they've had to deal with their whole lives.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the fact of where it comes from. And students are very good in terms of authenticity and in terms of being able to read these things. If they know that it's coming from a place of care and not from a place of surprise, then I think that most students will receive it in that way. I also think that validation, and the research shows that validation is more beneficial when it's task specific. So it's one thing to say, oh, wow, you're so smart. It's another thing to say, I read your paper and this is a wonderful example of what I was assigning. Do you mind if I showed it to the rest of the class as an example of what they could do? The research and validation shows that that second example is going to be more meaningful and less problem laden than the first example might be. I also want to acknowledge that yes, students do experience these issues, and they don't always come from white faculty. This is not like a binary experience. A person of color can get messages from other people of color as well that reaffirm these notions, because we're all socialized in the same society to perceive people in these ways. And so I do want to acknowledge that it can be more complex than that. I saw that there was another hand up, but then I think it went down. I think it was Gabriella and then Nicholas. I think those were the two that were next.
Yeah. Hi. I just wanted to add to what Miss Ellen said. I have this professor. She's amazing. She's on this call too, but she's very amazing. And she tells me a lot that I'm smart, and then she tells me that that I, she's very proud of me that I'm smart, and she says it in a very caring way. So that what Mr. Wood said too is right, that And we students, we know these things. We know what professors say and how they say it and what they mean. So when there's some things that happened to me in high school. Well, it happened to a friend of mine. She was in class, and she's from where I'm from. She's from Ghana as well. And then a professor, teacher, asked her if she lived in her house because she's from Ghana, which is in West Africa. So we know these things, and then we can tell, and it makes it difficult for us to trust our teachers and our professors. But then I've had great professors. Two of them are on this call. I don't know if I should put them on the spot, but they're amazing, and
you can always put people on the spot in a good way. Feel free to call out their names. I'm sure they'd appreciate it.
Okay, the first one is Helen O'Brien. She's amazing, and she's always in my corner. And the second one is Sarah Braun. She's also always in my corner, and they always help me, and they always push me to be a better student. So yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Nicholas, you're up, and then Don, you'll be our last.
Thanks. Nick from accounting. I do like the story where there's a language barrier. I know two cases myself where two Hispanics had a language barrier, went through, got their 60 credits. Today, they're police officers. And in the beginning, you would look at them the same way. However, today, they're looked at differently. Now they have an identity. They're police officers. They achieved what they wanted to achieve. So now they're sort of equal. Before they were not. And for me, I always use this. I say Nick from accounting because my last name is Martinez, and I was always known as identified as being Hispanic. So I always say Nick from accounting to re-identify myself. And I just want to see how people, it's my own study, how people view it. And it works. It's really cool. Identify yourself, and you can change people's perception. It works. The class is great, and I already tried some methods in my life before the class. I didn't realize there was something out there like this. So really cool. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And your case example of changing or leaving out your last name and noticing that there's a differential level of treatment that comes from that is one that is, I think, important for us to put in context of this. Our students should never have to change their identity in order to be able to fit in in an institution. So appreciate you sharing that as an example. I think Don was next.
Yeah, I just want to say this was a off the hook presentation. I mean, amazing. And I remember when your organization was called M2C3 back in the day. I flew out to San Diego University, and you and Woods were killing it out there too. So welcome to WCC. I also just wanted to make a couple of comments. Sometimes I think I was listening to Ellen earlier, and I think sometimes good intention, well-meaning individuals want to help in some way, right? And they're helping in a way in which they believe is correct. I don't think sometimes there's not malice in what they say. They're trying to get that emotive limbic system working in the right direction, but perhaps they haven't been taught how to say something that's complimentary as opposed to injurious. And I think that's probably more regular than it's not. It's just that en masse, because we live in this enormous system that has been pernicious in so many different ways to persons of color, because of the history, obviously, that things can kind of get a little entangled there. So, I just wanted to state that as we are in this forum of discussion. The other thing is that, I want to draw everyone's attention to the multiple intelligence theory out of Gardner and out of Harvard University, because I think it's very intentional and informative, because it's really about creating a safe space. And it's really about the dignity of humanity, of the human self, you know? And I think oftentimes in this relationship, we get disparaged, you know, through our conditioning, you know? And I think when Dr. Wood was talking about this idea that, you know, we have to approach it from that intention, that is where we need to come from. It's the intentionality. And if the young person is feeling good, emotionally good about where you're coming from, things tend to work out. So that's all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you. And I know that we are at time, and so I just want to acknowledge that and thank you all for being here. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation. Thank you, Michelle, for your leadership, and I hope that everyone has a good rest of their day.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wood. This was an amazing, amazing presentation. You highlighted the responsibility that we have to each other as humans, the responsibility we have to each other as members of the campus community. The Raven approach that you shared is a very powerful framework for us to use and keep in mind. I'm grateful for all you shared with us today, and you've been so generous with your thoughts, and you gave us a lot to ponder as we move into our debriefing portion of the program. Everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Wood. Clap it up, put it in the chat. It was amazing. Okay, so we are now going to be moving into our breakout rooms for our facilitated debriefing sessions to process the ideas presented today and to consider what they might mean for the WCC community. The breakout room discussions will run for about 25 minutes, and they will not be recorded. Following the debriefing sessions, we will come back to the main room for a closing activity. So please stay with us until the end. Okay, once again, thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Wood. So we will now move into our breakout rooms.
Oh, goodbye. I'm sorry I can't stay. I have to leave now.
All right, thank you, Ernesto.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, good morning.
Hello.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I guess if it can happen, it does happen. And so we roll with it, right? We just roll.
You're doing fine, Michelle. Everything is fine.
Thank you, Joe. Good seeing you, Joe.
This is great.
Okay.
Time to talk.
Yes. Yes. All right. So welcome back, everyone. I'm sure there were some really powerful ideas that were shared and discussed. And so now I'm going to ask each of the facilitators to share with us the most salient thoughts that came up during your group discussions. And I think there was one room that didn't have a facilitator. So if I go through it all and your group didn't have the opportunity to share, Cynthia, Jennifer, and Diana. Okay, oh no, you're saying thank you. Okay, got it. Woo. All right, let's start with Professor Champel.
I think we just simply didn't have enough time, right? I think all of us could have talked on and on and on. We got through like a question and a half, maybe. But one of the things I thought was a really sort of interesting conversation was when Luke talked about, like, he gave language to this idea of colorblind and what people actually mean, or what he thinks they mean when people say, oh, I'm colorblind. And Joe was with me, Marissa was with me, Stephanie joined us at the end, and Marissa was making this really interesting point about like the evolution of a generational perspective towards like what it means to say you're colorblind. Like that there was a generation that was raised where like, that's how you learn, you're colorblind, it doesn't matter. And it's interesting, you know, as then you progress and now it's like, no, you recognize the color and you respect it and you love it no different, right? That there's this sort of evolution in the way in which we discuss it, in which children are being raised. And that, like, you know, if you step backwards generationally, there are a lot of bias that that's just the way it is, you know, like there's no use having conversations maybe with parents about statements they might make or the way that they see things. So, and Joe really appreciated sort of having a scaffolding for and language for discussing the idea of being colorblind.
Yes, that was great, and thank you for bringing that up, Marissa. I think it's an interesting perspective. You know, if we think about the time of, you know, everyone is everybody, we're all together, and we're all, the whole idea of a melting pot, that we all just kind of melt and become one, which then in essence erases who we are.
Right, takes away the things about us that are unique and special, and yeah, devalues those aspects.
Exactly. Perfect, thank you. All right, Dr. Hamawi.
Hi, everyone. So we had a good discussion in our group, and we focused on the question of, you know, what can we do to raise awareness of the issue of microaggressions, and how to educate the campus community, not just students, but, you know, faculty, staff, administrators. We talked about the importance of overt communication and getting the message out there. We were thinking about the mission statement, the value statement, is it posted on campus, things like that. Dr. Martinez-Lopez, she reminded us that it is now posted in front of the buildings, the mission statement. Can we post a value statement? Maybe not, maybe it's too long. What about having something on the desks of faculty at the beginning of each term or each academic year about DEI? You know, with some tips and guidelines. Faculty maybe could remind themselves prior to every class meeting. I was thinking about this. Before you enter that class, to make sure you're engaged in that deliberate, thoughtful, conscious way of thinking, as opposed to that other type of thinking where you're more likely to lapse and make comments that are microaggressive. So it's not just awareness, it's frequent reminders that we need, because it's always going to be within you in your unconscious mind. If you remind yourself, you could prevent that from getting expressed with your nonverbal behaviors. Dr. Evans shared her own experience is with some microaggression, the nonverbal behavior, the people not speaking to her in the elevator and things like this. So we have to monitor that as well, not just what we say, but how we say it, our facial expressions, our distance, and so forth, the nonverbal behaviors.
That was wonderful. Thank you. I think it just highlights the importance of these kinds of conversations that should never be one and done. And I'm seeing in the chat that people are requesting to continue the conversations that we're having today, which I think is beautiful. Professor Wasserman.
Hi, everyone. We had a great discussion. We started off kind of about the aha moment of kind of linking sometimes what we see as a lack of confidence in students to the possibility that where does that lack of confidence come from? And thinking it's not just that this student can't do it. Maybe they've had experiences in the past that have shaped them, that have fed into that, and to just be more mindful of that. Then we had a great discussion about in the moment, if something comes out, let's say in a classroom or in a meeting that is seriously not appropriate for the group, how do we handle that? Do we wait and talk to the person on the side, or do we address it right away? And how do we address it so that we're not making the situation worse? And Dr. Ramsey was in our group, which was wonderful. And she talked about the idea of saying the words. If that was a racist statement, say that was a racist statement, or that was bias against, gay people, or that was bias against women, whatever it is. And the idea of addressing it right away and not letting it be seen as, oh, it wasn't important enough, or it was okay that somebody said something like that, even though none of us liked it. And the work that we all maybe need to do to be aware, to be able to take that on and deal with things a little bit more upfront, because perhaps now we have more understanding of why that is so important. So great discussion.
Great, thank you so much. I think, your comments highlight the kind of going something with piggyback on what Nicole was saying. There was a time which, you just look the other way.
Right.
You just ignore it to avoid conflict, to avoid having other, having things mushroom. But the consequence of that is that it snowballs and it sends the message that that kind of behavior is okay.
Right.
And I think we're saying as a community that this is too important for us to look away.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Professor Braun.
Hi, thank you so much for the extra time. We really needed it. We got into very meaningful discussions. What came up was this parallel between, teacher and student, which was the focus of today's presentation, but microaggressions between colleagues, here at WCC, and the need for, in addition to individual introspection and individual change, the need for a structure that exists whereby if somebody has experienced years, as was the case in our group, of microaggressions and gone to their supervisor or gone to a VP and had it never addressed, never resolved, that we need a structure, an independent, now we have Dr. Reddick, but an independent office, an independent place where you go if your situation is not being addressed, not being resolved. So that was key. So I hope we can. I won't forget this. So hopefully we, this will, because it really, it takes a toll, and the person who's sharing is saying, look, I'm an adult, I can take care of myself, I'm a good advocate, and it still has, it still goes on, and affects me. What about students, who have more fear than I do of reporting, so it really just was like a microcosm of the dynamic.
Yeah, I've seen a model at other campuses, my previous institution, that had a bias response task force, and that as soon as an incident was reported, steps were put into place to address it. And part of it was carrying, the messaging to the campus community that, things spread like wildfire, people find out what's happening, and attending to the campus community in addition to attending to the individuals who were impacted by the incident. And there were, different levels, different officers that were put into place that had responsibilities on that task force to take care of the different issues at play. So, perhaps something for us to consider. Okay, Jessica Gramajo, our alum.
Hi.
Thank you for helping us with this day, Jessica.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Michelle. So Josh, Leonore, and Ernesto were in our group, and we talked mostly about the Raven approach and, in what ways we can use that to continue fostering a sense of belonging and success for, our students of color. We really talked about, just advocacy and speaking up is something that is a huge part of the Latinx and, culture. But at the same time, it can be very difficult and challenging to do that in the classroom. And so having the structure of implementing the Raven approach is helpful. And also just other things that where we kind of try to pull examples of when we've used that approach in the past without knowing. And so some of those examples were walking students through a situation when if they had to, you know, if they came to us and disclosed that they were having a challenging situation in the classroom with a faculty member, it wasn't just a matter of hearing them out and saying like, you know, okay, well, you know, I hope it goes well, or, you know, it was the matter of actually, you know, talking them through, okay, you know, let's practice. How are you going to approach, you know, this conversation? You know, what do you have to do? You know, and just kind of coaching them through that process as well, talking them through that process. Leonor shared, you know, walking them through how to even write an email or response to an email address. So kind of practicing, you know, those equitable, you know, things as well when working with our students. And yeah, I mean, just helping not only our students find their voice, but their, you know, our community find their voice as well. Michelle, you mentioned that I'm an alum, right? Now I work at the college. And so, but just because of that, you know, I'm still a Latinx professional. I'm still a person of color, right? And so in what ways do we, you know, continue to foster and take these same steps for our colleagues as well and show kindness, you know, in those ways. So yeah, that's most of what we discussed.
Great, thank you. I think that, you know, talking about being an empowering advocate for our students and even for our colleagues at times to help them, as you said, coach them through a process. Thank you for that. Dr. Joseph.
We had a great conversation. We talked about how, first of all, just from the first question, we talked about the different microaggressions that were mentioned and really talked about subconscious and implicit bias and how that plays a role in some of the things that we do and some of the things that we say. And we just brought up, we also talked about our students who are multicultural or bilingual, how hard they try because they're concerned about their writing and their their speaking, and how we have to really put ourselves in their shoes to encourage them and validate their experiences. And we talked about our own biases in that as well. We also covered the Raven approach because part of the discussion was, how do we respond? And we talked about different positions that you're in when you responded. I, for example, am at times in a position of authority as being the director of a center, but at times I'm not, just as an example. So how do you respond when you're in authority, when you're not in authority, when you're experiencing someone who is above you? And we took that experience and we kind of connected it to the students and how they feel as well. And how can we kind of do more self-assessing to kind of mitigate those experiences for the students. We talked about the importance of having some type of rubric, kind of similar to what you mentioned in terms of the bias response task force, that there has to be something or a way for these issues to be addressed in a professional manner. I had reached out to Dr. Wood. I sent him a personal chat because my question was to him, are there resources that you can point me to address microaggressive behavior when it happens to us personally? And I would just want to read his response because this was the response I read to the group. And then we talked about how to encourage each other and how to kind of be upstanders, as he puts it. So he said, I'm not aware of a good one, but I think the recommendations we offer around race lighting are important. Be connected to a community within your community that values you. Be connected to a community outside of the institution that values you. Never stay in an environment that is pervasively unhealthy, which is hard if it's your job. Engage in positive affirmations and encourage allies to be upstanders. And so that fifth one, encourage allies to be upstanders, we had a conversation around that in terms of what does that mean? Does it mean kind of connecting with someone and having a conversation to address it? Does it mean being more self-reflective, being an upstander yourself? And so we also kind of talked about needing more resources to address them. And I just also like to add, this was actually my dissertation topic, but instead of students, it was Black women in professional Black women. So I was like super excited about everything that we're talking about in terms of this topic. But I just had to mention that because I'm just so excited about it. But we talked about what it's like for women of color, for example, of different identities, but women of color, and how at times women of color need to self-advocate. And so students will have this experience as well. And so it could go in other directions, students being perceived, or a woman of color being perceived as angry, like angry Black woman stereotype, or the opposite, a woman of color having to speak up more because they don't want to be ignored. And so these are some of the issues. We kind of went in a few different directions. It was a great discussion. And if anybody in my group, if I missed anything that was like really important to say, please speak up. But
no, Nicole, you did a great job, but you have to share with us your dissertation, your research.
I will. I haven't put myself out there yet. Last year, and all of a sudden the topic became more relevant than ever. And so I will put myself out there.
Wow. So we had a learning moment for ourselves individually too, throughout this problem. Great. Let's see. Professor Bias.
Hi. So I think that one of the key takeaways from our conversation goes to action. And so we started talking first, just appreciating the Raven model, right? Getting concrete examples of how one can approach these events that we may be part of or we may witness. And that we can't just be bystanders, right? Some of us are in roles where you can't be a bystander because your responsibility is to look after the student population. As an instructor, you can't be a bystander because you are such an active agent in the classroom. So thinking about how we can do things. So one of the things that came up was also needing resources, and within our own group, one of the members shared a resource that the other could use to develop some content into their syllabus about community dynamics. So I think a takeaway from that would be enhancing the resources that are available from, for instance, CTL, but then also we have a broad community that has experience in best practices around this. And so being able to connect with each other and collect those kinds of resources is really important. One of the how we were actually ending our conversation, so action resources, was also going well beyond just specific constructs of diversity or minoritized populations, and he pointed to one example briefly, thinking about the intersectional quality of the students' experiences, right? Not only are we supposed to recognize diversity, but that diversity in itself is not uniform in any kind of way around sexuality, gender identification, ability status, and also especially class status. That doesn't get as much talked about. To intersect that with the traditional thinking of, racial and ethnic issues, which is something that maybe like as we progress in our institution and in our culture changes, we can start to imbue a little bit more of that intersectional approach to things. So, and thank you to our team members. We got cut off. I didn't get to say thank you. So I thanked you guys in the chat, but thank you again. That was great. And thank you to this group for the opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think, what you're pointing out is that it's, there's many layers to this. And, and again, while it's important to talk about minoritized groups, there's so much breadth and scope involved in that, and that needs to be considered. Thank you. Now, Doctors Reddick and Fortune, you guys are both in one group. We try to pull you out to help out another group, and then you guys went back into your group. So I'm going to turn over to both of you to share that one.
And I will yield to Dr. Fortune.
Okay.
So yeah, you did. You tried to pull us out, but our conversation was so engaging. So we had Dr. Brown and Gabriella Porte in our group, and as you said, you pulled me out twice, but I jumped back in. But we got into the first two questions, but it was for me, I was so excited to have 3 administrators and 1 student. So apologies, Gabriella, if I put you on the spot, but I wanted to hear more. We wanted to hear more from the student perspective. She thought about Dr. Wood's presentation, because I know for Dr. Reddick and I, we've experienced this presentation a few times on different topics. Not sure about Dr. Brown, but I think this may have been her first. So I wanted to give her the floor. And, you know, I have to congratulate her that, you know, she's coming into her voice and she understands that sometimes it's about power. You know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So in high school with her teachers and the professors, you have to pick and choose. Unlike myself, I probably just shout it out and get people upset with me across campus, but that's what we do. So she understands that, and I'm very happy that she's coming into her power and understand her place in the world. So with that, you know, I agree with some of our colleagues that, you know, when you hear people say things, we were using the Raven approach even before we knew it was the Raven approach, you know, like, what, you know, and asking questions in clarity. So that was good. And you have to address issues. Plus, one of the things that we spoke about was, you know, we all have conflicts in our family. So WCC is like a family, and you never think that these types of things happen in your family, but of course they do. You're biased because you don't think these types of micro and macro aggressions and explicit bias happen in your family, but they do. So that's the things you have to, that we were speaking of, about. You always think it's that institution or that campus or that family, and you have to look in sometimes. And that's the hardest part, is challenging your colleagues or your coworkers and thinking, what you just said doesn't make sense. Didn't make sense. Please explain it to us. And you know, that's just simply not true that it happens across in all families. So I don't think I missed anything. If I did, Dr. Brown, Gabriella, forgive me, or Dr. Reddick can say something, but I think our discussion touched all these questions, but it really focused on the first 2, because I wanted to see how Dr. Wood's presentation impacted her. And, you know, just from our discussion, I could see that things she said in high school and her growth now. So I'm going to take some pride in how she turns out just from this little microcosm of discussion. But, and I'm glad that we had a student in our group.
Yes. And I'm very thankful to Gabriella for participating in this event. And I think, you know, Dr. Fortune, something you said about, you know, WCC is our family. And, you know, when your family is facing difficulty, you do what you can to show them care, right? And I think we're trying to do the same thing right now for our campus. That it's, again, our shared responsibility that we have to our family. And I think the Raven framework helps us, you know, have a tool that we can use to think about that and to approach those situations perhaps a little differently than we might have before. Dr. Seeholster.
Okay, before I begin, I noticed that Sandra has had her hand up for a while there. Maybe
okay.
See what it is she wanted to say, and then I'll talk.
Oh, okay. No, thank you so much, Patty. Thank you, but I'll wait for you to finish before I make my comment. You're awesome. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Our group spent a little time introducing ourselves to one another because we did not actually know each other, all of us.
That's great.
So yes, I was very happy to get to know some more people. And unfortunately, 2 of our members had, in fact, faced situations in which microaggressions occurred. And so we heard their stories about that, which were very moving. But we also focused on the idea of Raven and the fact that it was a concept that was both new to us, and at the same time, we realized we have been rehearsing it or using some of it at any rate. As I think it was Eric said, their group also realized that. A couple of groups said that. We like the concept because it enables us to, one of the people said, prepare ahead of time, so that we have something in our toolbox, so to speak, ready to go, and we can ask ourselves about what are we going to do. when that situation happens in our classroom. Another thing that we talked about is that in many ways, you have to apply it. It's not a one size fits all. Different situations require different ways of handling things. You might need to do it as a pull somebody aside. If you're walking across campus and you hear a group of students, you might stop and chat with them. If on the other hand, you're in an office situation, you might want your whole office to stop for a minute and think about these things, have a little dialogue about it. We talked about the fact that, that awareness, that dialogue about it, facing it, as some other group here said, is very important. One member talked about the fact that words have a lasting effect and that triggers are sometimes spawned by those words that we use. So we have to think about them. We have to monitor ourselves, and we do hold the responsibility to the whole community, as others here have said. Another thing that was a big takeaway is that people of color can experience microaggressions from other people of color. Several in our group mentioned that that was kind of a new concept to them. And we ended by, I asked them to use Padlet to talk about what they might do as they move forward. We ran out of time, as all of us did. We could have this conversation going for a very long time, and we should, in fact, keep it going for a very long time. But I'll just give you a quick peek. If can I share the screen? Yes?
You should be a co-host, yep.
Okay. So again, we did not finish. Not everybody got a chance to post, but you can see there some of the things that we have committed to. And we thought this was important to kind of, close the session with committing ourselves to some actions that we might actually take as a result of the learning we have achieved through this presentation. So we have being aware of the after effect of microaggression on an individual can create a safe space of acceptance, being comfortable. I will monitor myself better to be sure. I will talk to colleagues. We need to hold each other in a constant learning and accountability mode. Don't be afraid to speak up when a microaggression has happened. So that was, I think, unless I missed something, those are the highlights of our group. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I think what you spoke about touches on the whole concept of the racial battle fatigue. And that is a real, dynamic that many of our students face and many of us face at times. And it can compromise one's ability to engage and to be successful. Absolutely. Sandra, you wanted to say something.
Thank you so much for allowing me to speak up. I promised my group I wouldn't say too much because my dissertation is on community college freshmen perceptions of microaggressions in the classroom, right? So what I wanted to say is it goes back to what Professor Wasserman had said about responding in the moment, using the words, all of that. And one of the things that is critical, and I'm putting Dr. Reddick on the spot, that CTL has done a great job of introducing the concept of microaggressions as well. Sorry, I didn't realize you were calling me. I'm kind of nibbling on something. Is that we have to do training for faculty, especially for all of us, but for faculty especially, because faculty are the most important when it comes to the students, because that's where community college students receive their socialization, is that we need to train faculty on how to have difficult conversations in the classroom. Because one of the things that I heard faculty say over and over, I don't know how to address it. Do I address it? And if I address it, how do I address it? We have to have these difficult conversations. Some people's feelings are going to be hurt, but that's okay, because some of us, our feelings have been hurt for a long time. So the conversations must be difficult. As Professor Wasserman said, if we have to talk about racism, sexism, homophobia, we have to use the language, all right? And so this goes back to something that Dr. Joseph had said. There are people on this campus with some expertise. Let us make use of those individuals, because we can't have a one and done conversation, as Dr. Campagna said. So Dr. Reddick, here's looking at you to create continued conversations around microaggressions, racial battle fatigue, all of that. How do we handle microaggressions? Because there are different frameworks that we can use, but let us make use of the expertise that we have within as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. There was one group that did not have a facilitator. If anybody from that group would like to share. Okay. If they're not, I guess if we are done with the sharing portion, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hamawi for the closing activity and Professor Wasserman.
Thank you, Michelle.
I'm sorry, Camille. We were in a group of 2 facilitators, myself, Rodina, Jelaine, and Susan. I don't know if Rodina, you wanted to share.
Oh, Rodina. Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay, Helena. We were both facilitators in the same group, so I can just share briefly. I know time is kind of getting biased, but we had a great conversation as well, and we talked a lot about the impact of the Raven model. And one or two of the things that really stood out and really kind of guided the conversation was the whole notion of just being authentic. How do we affirm, make sure that for moving forward, that we are mindful of what we're saying to our students? You know, if so, for example, a comment came up, like how do we tell students, give them feedback about writing, similar to what Dr. Luke had discussed, you know, make sure that we're giving examples about the writing, really trying to do some self-reflection and being mindful of the impact that we have on our students and affirm the way that we communicate to them, and really being aware of the race lighting and how we have control in our classrooms, and what we say, how we interact with them can again impact the way that these students feel about themselves. So making sure that we're doing that. Another thing that we talked about was speaking from a place of compassion and personality, and how the various and individual personalities might impact the way that we respond to witnessing microaggressions, and how do we address that? How do we speak up and feel comfortable addressing that, realizing that sometimes our personality might come through that as well. And then the one other thing that I want to share is that I believe it was mentioned that students can also tell when professors are not being authentic. And so that perception of authenticity can determine whether or not a student will stay in the classroom or make a decision to leave. So again, really just, you know, realizing the control and the power, the impact that we have as educators, and how to be sure that moving forward, we're just doing a lot of self-reflecting, you know, looking at our own implicit biases, and how to make sure that we're doing better and improving the way that we impact and talk to our students.
Yes, the importance of self-awareness as for us as educators, and how we might be transmitting our thoughts, feelings, implicit biases throughout. Thank you.
I jump in real quick. I apologize. I heard my name. I actually had walked up to the kitchen. And so sorry, Dr. Ramsey, for missing your call out to me, but I heard what you were saying in the background, and there are definitely work that continues to need to be done. So thank you for those thoughts, Dr. Ramsey.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, God. Thank you all. All right. Dr. Hamawi, Professor Wasserman, our closing.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for everyone for sharing the discussion points from your groups. It was great to hear. So we thought we'd end with 2 activities. The first one is to just generate a word cloud of what impacted you the most. Ellen's going to provide some instructions on that. I just put the link in there again. So you can click on that link. Did you see it there in the chat? I just put it there again.
Yep,
so
got it.
Go ahead, click on that link, and Ellen's going to provide some instructions of what to do there.
Okay, which from
Hey everyone, who? There is a link to menti.com in the chat. Camille has just posted it. I'll post it again right now. And there's a code there. So if you would just click on it and go to the Menti. And oops, I just posted the wrong one. So let me do that again. Go to the Menti and enter the code, and you can, our question there is, what words describe some of the ideas that you heard today that resonate with you the most? So I'm going to share, I'm going to get that link in there one more time. Sorry. And then I'm going to share the screen so you can all see some of the words that are developing. There we go. We can watch it build.
So as we're looking at this, we see introspection being something mentioned quite a bit. I believe the bigger the word, the more it's mentioned. The Raven approach that was discussed quite a bit in the group's very useful framework, as Michelle was saying, that we could think about continuing to use on our campus. Racial battle fatigue. That was a new term for me as well, related to the concept of racial trauma. Race lighting. Another sort of newer construct that again draws attention to the cumulative effects of microaggressions across time. Family, remember that being mentioned. We're a family here at WCC, right? And conflicts occur in all families. And addressing it is not meant to draw negative attention to us, but to grow as an institution. So lots of great ideas mentioned here. Self-awareness, awareness, I see mentioned there as well. Values clarification. The importance of trainings was mentioned. So we thought we'd end with one last activity, optional for those who want to type something up in the chat, an action. Something that you think our institution should emphasize, or maybe something at the individual level as well. It could be collective action, individual action, some kind of action, some kind of next step that you would like to see happen at WCC. You could go ahead and type that in the chat. And then I'd like to mention there's some reminders about our programming for next year offered through the Center for Teaching and Learning. As Nicole was mentioning at the beginning, we have our theme of working together, inclusivity, collaboration, and reflection. And we already have some programming. Dr. Stevens, Bodina Stevens, is going to be doing a second session on the topic of inclusivity in the classroom. So we encourage you to watch the recording of the one she gave last spring, spring semester, and then come to her follow-up presentation. And we're also going to be looking for other proposals. So of course, trainings could be offered through Dr. Reddick's office, but also we could offer some degree of workshop and training through CTL. So if you have some expertise and interest, go ahead and submit a proposal. We have that new process where you could submit a proposal to the Faculty Advisory Committee. They review it. We have a consultation with the CTL directors, and then we determine a programming for the academic year. So keep that in your mind and consider that if you want to run one of these workshops for your faculty colleagues. So with that, I'll turn it back to Michelle.
All right. Well, we've stayed 16 minutes longer than we've intended, and we still are 30 strong on this Zoom meeting, which just shows me that there is a commitment at this institution to making our students' educational experiences as validating, in the words of Larendon, and valuable as possible for them, for their families, for their communities. And I think it's also how we're feeling about our experiences as individuals, as humans, and our relationship with one another. That sense of community, I think, is incredibly important to all of us at WCC. So I thank you all for your participation, your contributions, your care, your compassion, your time, your participation, and your commitment. And we will continue having these discussions. Like, there's definitely an interest in keeping this going. So all the best to you.
You too.
Thank you, Ernesto. All right. Take care, everyone. Be well.
You too.
We'll talk again very soon.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Michelle.
All right.
Thanks, Michelle. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Michelle. Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Michelle, I'll stop recording.
Have a good day, everyone. And I guess I'll see you on not this